He says, on the same subject, and this is his son writing on his dad's letter, on the same subject, my father wrote in 1871, it is often said that all the conditions for the first production of the living organism are now present, which could ever have been present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes at the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before the living creatures were formed. What is Darwin saying? Darwin's trying to understand how that very first cell, that protocell, could have possibly come into existence. Does Darwin know it exists? No, but Darwin has faith. He has faith. That's where religion comes in. When you believe something, you can't test it, you can't test it. He has faith. So let's see if what he has faith in can be viable. And so I'm just going to give you a couple examples why evolution, macroevolution, from the atheistic perspective is an impossibility, okay? It's an impossible faith system. So the first myth, the first one, and I say myth because, again, it's a myth that this protocell was existing. It's pure faith that there was this first cell out there. When I mean protocell, here's the tree of life. And that little dot there would have been the very first cell that came into existence. Well, why is it, Phil, why are you so sure it can't happen? Because that very first cell, it would have to be able to replicate itself. And replication requires something. First, that very first cell is going to require all what's called the organelles. Just like you have a heart, a lung, a liver, a pancreas. All these are organs within your body. That first cell also has functions, organelles that are necessary for it to exist, for it to live, okay? For it to exist. Now, that very first cell would not only have to have a complete set of functioning organelles, but that very first cell would have to have a complete blueprint of all the equipment and how to replicate it in the very next cell. If each one of these tables were cells, then in order for this table to be replicated, it'd have to have a complete set of not only the equipment, but the blueprint on how to build all that equipment. And it'd have to be in the very first cell. Now the question is, how would it get into that very first cell? Well, the atheistic evolutionist, I'm not talking about theistic evolutionists, but the atheistic evolutionists say, well, the only way it could have got there was through random occurrence of chemical interactions. That's the only way. It has to be random chance. But not only that, you have to have literally thousands of protein compounds that would need to appear at the same time. This is pure religion. You can't verify it, you can't test it. It's all based upon faith. That's just one problem, okay? Problems multiply. Because then we look at what's called protein synthesis, okay? What's protein synthesis, okay? Protein synthesis is the creation of proteins within that cell. That cell, in order for that cell to maintain itself, because things are constantly breaking down in cells. It's tough being a cell these days, okay? But things are constantly breaking down, so you need to constantly rebuild the equipment that's necessary in that cell. And the way that's done is with proteins. Proteins are the building blocks within cells. Now, what's required to build a protein? There's not one way to build proteins other than through what's called a ribosome, okay? Ribosomes are the equipments in a simple bacteria cell will have over 1,200 ribosomes within it, okay? But what is the ribosome? The ribosome itself is made of over 50 unique proteins. There's two parts, a large unit and a subunit. So the mRNA is taken into the ribosome. The ribosome then attaches the corresponding corresponding amino acids to that mRNA to build that protein. But guess what you need? You need proteins to make proteins. So the very first cell would have had to have proteins. Well, then someone will say, well, maybe the very first cell didn't have a ribosome. Well, That's not the case today. So if you say that, then it's faith-based, because you have to still have the proteins, okay, including lots of the other parts of equipment. So the very first cell would have needed to have proteins. You can't base upon what you don't know. All we can do is go what we do know. Proteins are required to make proteins, and it would be the very same in the very first cell. So going back to the tree of life. The tree of life and the whole idea that information is added to the protocell, so we get all these macroevolutionary changes. So for example, from the lizard to get wings requires macroevolutionary changes. How does that new information get added to the organism? What's the source of that new information? Well, it's not natural selection, because natural selection is based upon the information that's already present in the organism. So the system that most people say, there is no other option other than a new information we get through random mutation. Random mutation. So what we need is mutations, but the problem is random mutations are negative. I mean, there's been studies that have shown that random mutations, out of 453,000 random mutations, only 186 had any kind of benefit. That's a huge lopsided percentage of harmful mutations to beneficial. So that's a downward progression. So the only way of adding additional information is through mutations. Again, impossibility. Huge problem. Now, a lot of people will then say, well, the fossil record shows that evolution occurred. That's incontrovertible evidence and I say, well, no, not the case, because I can show you lots of examples of contrived evidence. What is contrived evidence? Now, we go back to the scientific method with the testing theories. Well, contrived evidence is sometimes when evidence is just not showing up. So you work really hard to make sure that evidence shows up. And I'll give you some examples. One example is known as Piltdown Man. Anybody here familiar with Piltdown Man? Raise your hand if you've never heard of Piltdown Man before. Okay. Well, a lot of people have never heard of Piltdown Man. They've never taught Piltdown Man in high schools and so forth and so on. Why? Because Piltdown Man is a great example of manufactured evidence. There was a skull found in Piltdown, England, and a guy named Dawson, or they think is also known as Dawson's Man, they attached an orangutan's jaw to the skull. They filed down the teeth, and it was presented as evidence to the Royal Society, along with the Royal Society of Geology Society of London. In 1912, it was presented as evidence. Sir Arthur Keith was one of the main proponents. Now, who was Sir Arthur Keith? Okay, he was considered the leading paleontologist and anthropologist of his day. He was head of it. I mean, that's why he was called Sir, because he was knighted for his great understanding. So what happened? Well, him along with another guy who was head of the American Natural History Museum, Henry Fairfield Osborn, also put forward that Piltdown Man came out later that it was a complete forgery. And these were experts. So just because someone's an expert doesn't mean that they're right. And they have presuppositions. People want to look for the evidence. Now, there were other people who said, no, it's not the case. But these guys were the experts. And the forgery was so powerful because it was repeated twice that people just went with it. Another example, not too long after that, is known as Nebraska Man. Anybody heard of Nebraska Man? Okay. Well, if you never heard of Nebraska Man, again, there was a guy named Cook found a tooth in Nebraska. And he sent it to the head of the American Natural History Museum, Fairfield Osborn, okay? And Fairfield Osborn examined it and said, yes, this is an example of Western ape. And so he made cast of it, he sent it to England, and the guy in England whose name was Grafton Elliott Smith, okay? He confirmed that this, yes, is a Western ape, and they made a drawing and put the drawing in the Illustrated London News, 1922. This was the drawing of Nebraska Man and his family. Later they decided, well, hey, let's actually go back and look at where that tooth was found. And you guess what they found? A pig, okay? It was a tooth of a pig, okay? And I can go on and on. There's Neanderthal Man. Neanderthal Man was early taught that it was an apish, dumb species of early man. Later on, they decided to actually go and look at the skeletal system. And the skull turned out Neanderthal Man had a cc capacity of brain of 1,400 cc's, which is more than that of the average man. And that Neanderthal Man was not a dumb brain. He had rheumatoid arthritis. He had a vitamin D deficiency, which gave him his look. Again, Lucy's another example, which is Australopithecus, southern ape, which is, she's a chimpanzee. But yet it was put forward. In fact, if you look on the illustration I handed out, you can see this, the bones that were found. And then you can see what was constructed from those bones. Because this is manufacture of evidence. And this builds presuppositions. Because you go to a museum and you see southern ape, standing upright with their hand up. And you go, hey, man, how can I argue with that? That's pretty strong evidence. Again, that builds a presupposition into your viewpoint. So it's important in understanding how these presuppositions develop and what we believe, and why do we believe what we believe.